You have a decent gap between the Breeders' Cup and the Pegasus itself. You have some decent preps that could be elevated if it's a 1.25 mile race. And I think if you run it at a 1.25 mile, it's a more legitimate event. But last but not least, one of the most interesting things, or one of the more dynamic things about Gulfstream Park is, in the creation of the Pegasus, is the fact that now they, at this point, unless otherwise noted, there's no piggyback effect. And what I mean by that is there's no Pegasus piggyback, is the fact that the racetrack is only wide enough to accommodate 12 starting gates, which of course we all know the 12 hole is basically the Bermuda Triangle in terms of the draw at Gulfstream Park. Very difficult with that short run to the first turn for horses, whether you have speed, especially if you have speed, to win there. There's no question about that. Big Brown was one of those exceptions. I think he came out of the 10 hole to win the Florida Derby. Might have even come out of the 12. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the point is that the Gulfstream officials, somewhere in the renovation of the racetrack, they forgot about making this racetrack Breeders' Cup certified and worthy, or Breeders' Cup eligible, in terms of, because the weather is obviously a plus for Gulfstream Park. And some would wonder, if you haven't even already thought, how come Gulfstream Park hasn't hosted the Breeders' Cup for ages? They have been one of the more historic and important and key fixtures in terms of Breeders' Cup hosting. And we all know now, given the pendulum swinging toward the warm weather climate, particularly of Santa Anita, with the exception of Churchill Downs getting it in 2018, even Churchill has lost momentum and traction in terms of being a host, even though I believe that Churchill and Belmont Park are the two best venues to have the Breeders' Cup. And there's some other cold weather sites that, unfortunately, because of the weather at that time of the year, whether it be late October or early November, it's precluded them from being on the short list or the decent list, a formidable list of hosts. And that would be Woodbine, that would be Arlington Park. Those places were really, really good venues with world-class turf courses that draw the Europeans in to a greater degree. So those two racetracks, along with Belmont, lose out, in addition to Aqueduct nearby at Ozone Park that hosted the second Breeders' Cup in 1985. They've never, ever since that day gotten a sniff, and that's mainly because Belmont is kind of the key primary location, and it is more logistically feasible and a more attractive spot. But now at this point in the game, Belmont Park has also fallen off the radar, and this is where Gulfstream Park, we've always known in the rotational shift, in the rotation of Breeders' Cup hosts, they were always in the mix, getting it every 2-3 years or so forth, if you look at the history, along with the California tracks and even Churchill Downs. And now Gulfstream Park has, created a tremendous logistical error by not being in the current mix right now. They should be right there with California, and this is what needs to happen. They need to basically, as I've said before, like the Pegasus, it needs to be a $10 to $12 million race for number one. But what they need is to be able to do a re-renovation on this racetrack so that they can get that Pegasus piggyback where they host the Breeders' Cup, and then in the next couple months they also, knowing they have the Pegasus on an annual basis, every so often when they get the Breeders' Cup, they get that added bonus in terms of revenue, handle, goods and services, and the things that a sporting event is going to bring in, that extreme amount of commerce, just like with colleges with football teams, are going to generally make more money than Division I, II, and III schools that don't have a football team. That is the linchpin, or basically the biggest cash cow. That's the money maker. Football fuels all of the other businesses. And in horse racing, when you can get a Breeders' Cup, let's say if Churchill Downs, who hosted the 2018 Breeders' Cup, had a race of the caliber of the Pegasus at the beginning of the year, well, you know that given the handle and the numbers, people parking their cars and, drinking beverages and food, and the food and beverage and everything that goes with it, programs being sold, they would be that much more aided and abetted and supplemented by having a race of the caliber of the Pegasus. And I'm actually shooting for maybe the John Asher Memorial or something of that nature to be like a big event in Kentucky. Maybe not in January, but somewhere in the Derby preps or during the summer or even the fall in the lead up to the Breeders' Cup. But in terms of, focusing back on Gulfstream Park, if they were able to make that racetrack suitable for the Breeders' Cup, because the weather is definitely a slam dunk. We all know Florida weather and California weather are much part and parcel of the same sunny package. So if you can get that, then what, Gulfstream will have, as I aforementioned, is the Breeders' Cup, and then the momentum from that, and maybe even getting more horses to participate in the Pegasus and pony up whatever the entry fee is, whether it be $500,000 or if you ramp it up to $12 million, $1 million like in the first year and in the second year. And also, you know, the horses running in the Breeders' Cup also get an opportunity to get a race over the Gulfstream track and sort of at a high level get what we call a dry run, a free roll of the dice, but with millions of dollars on the line. So you have an opportunity, if you do well at the Breeders' Cup, to be able to improve upon what you've done at the World Thoroughbred Championships, or correct any mistakes that have been made, and or hope that maybe even if your horse doesn't really relish the surface, they can find a way to, you know, to maybe perhaps work their way through that. So those are the logistical advantages of having a Breeders' Cup at Gulfstream if they can get that racetrack up to speed. But the added benefit of having the Breeders' Cup at Gulfstream Park is really something that is needed, and I'm very, very surprised Tim Ritvo and that group of that committee running the racetrack made that logistical error. It needs to be corrected, because nothing would be better, as I said before, than to have a Breeders' Cup at Gulfstream Park and also have the Pegasus coming right behind it at the distance of 1.25 miles. Again, once again, that is where you're going to get a what I call, and I've mentioned too many times, a perfect storm, a very, very seamless and well crafted setup in terms of running a Grade 1 race at that level. And I certainly am lobbying also for the Pegasus, in addition to Gulfstream getting Breeders' Cup certified and getting that racetrack back in order, is to also push for the 1.5 miles. Now, a lot of trainers do not want to, you know, go 1.5 miles in the first part of the year, but there are some stayers out there that would be benefited by, you know, already having the foundation, whether there's a layoff or whether there's a prep within a certain amount of weeks prior to a $12 million, 12 furlong Pegasus World Cup. I also think it might take a little bit away from the turf race, but you get some horses that don't have much to prove on the lawn to come to the dirt. We need more of that in the Breeders' Cup Classic and any of the other dirt races, the distaff and so forth, and the same holds true for the Pegasus. You could also, if Gulfstream Park had a happy medium logistically, where, you know, you have a chute where you could handle 20 horses like the Derby. What's the middle ground? You probably don't want to have 20 horses in the Pegasus or any graded race unless you have a race with 2 divisions. But, you know, there's the happy medium, you know, between 10 and 20, and that would be 15. So we know that you have to have a minimum of 14 stalls for the Breeders' Cup. So let's, you know, add a little wrinkle. Gulfstream gets that extra horse and make it 15, and you could even make the argument that 15 would be a good number for any Breeders' Cup host or any Breeders' Cup to have 15 horses running in the race. Some would say that's one more horse that can make the race dangerous or compromise the other 14, but you already got 14 in here. So what's the difference to have a 15th? And so Gulfstream needs to have the width configuration rise to at least accommodate 15. And not only that, that would make the Pegasus interesting. Maybe the World Pegasus could be the World Cup. The Pegasus World Cup could be a $15 million race. So rather than have 12 stalls, even if you want to do the Breeders' Cup minimum of 14, you have a $14 million race with the entry fee of $1 million, or you have a $15 million race at 1.25 miles. At 1.125 miles, I think it cheapens everything, although some believe they have a better chance at 9 furlongs than 10, but you had better break correctly or you're going to have a problem, especially with that short run to the first turn. So if you can get the width of the racetrack better, maybe even a better run to the first turn, and not only that, last but not least, a better stretch run, one that's a lot like Churchill Downs or Belmont or the Fairgrounds, which has a long stretch. As Gary Stevens used to say, that racetrack has its keys, just like Oaklawn Park. So if all those things can come together, then you have a perfect Pegasus World Cup thoroughbred, you know, horse race. So that's me, in my view, on some of the Pegasus problems, and then creating, going from having Pegasus problems to a perfect Pegasus World Cup championship.
Here's the